Hi everyone, welcome to the Planning Your Day webinar. Hi Norm, nice to see you here. I'm just gonna give it a couple of seconds so people can join. Have a sip of water. So I think the sound is working and the camera is working. I just noticed that it says 30 minutes plus questions. It's probably going to be a bit longer. So this is Marvin, in case you haven't seen this plush version of him. Anyway, he's going to join me here. So I think we can get started. People can always go back and, go back to the beginning. But yeah, we haven't started if you're just joining now. Oh, I see a lot of people are joining. Okay. Okay, I think we can get started. So again, I'm Christina. Hi, and welcome to the webinar. I'm the founder of Amazing Marvin, well, one of the founders. The other one is in the background there, Mark, my husband, and he will be in the chat, so you can chat with him there and ask questions, and I will go over the questions in the end. And so yeah, a lot of people might not be using Marvin right now who are watching this, because this webinar is not specific to Marvin. In case you're wondering what Marvin is a productivity tool, a personal productivity tool. It's kind of a hybrid between a to-do list and a calendar, and it's really flexible. And so yeah, but this webinar is about day planning, and it's not specific to Marvin. So if you like to use paper or you have another to-do app, this webinar will be helpful to you probably, because again, it's not specific to using Marvin. So let's go over the breakdown of this webinar, the topics we'll cover. And first we'll go over what is day planning and is it right for you? The second thing we'll cover is how to stick to a day plan, because making one is one thing, but sticking to it is another. And you might be curious why this comes before actually figuring out how to make a day plan, but it will all make sense when we get there. So then we'll talk about sort of the big overlying concepts of day planning, get into some specifics, some specific strategies and tips, and then we go over pitfalls, very important. So, and at the end we have questions. So what is day planning? When you think about day planning, what image do you get in your head? Is it maybe something like this or something like this? And actually you are right in both cases, because those are both day planning examples. On the left, we have the tasks on a calendar, as I call it, where you take tasks and you put them in your calendar, schedule them from specific times. And on the right, we just have a daily to-do list. So there's no time attached to it. It's just a to-do list, but it's a to-do list that you're trying to get done today. So this is to show you that day planning actually comes in many forms and sizes, and that's what we're going to get into later, because it's very, very versatile. There's not one way to do it. So sometimes it's maybe easier to talk about what is not day planning. So what does it look like, or your workflow look like, or your day look like when you do not day plan? What's the opposite? So maybe it goes something like this. At 8 o'clock you start working and you think, wow, there's so much to do. Where do I even start? Is the first question. Then maybe 10 minutes later, after some thinking about what you could do, you figure out, oh, I could do this. 20 minutes later, you finish the task and you ask yourself, now what? What do I do now? Again, you are confronted with all those things you have to do and you get kind of anxiety, so you maybe go on Facebook to kind of like soothe your feelings. And, 15 minutes pass and then you think, oh, I should really get work done. What should I do now? Not that there's not enough stuff to do, right? That's rarely a problem. So basically, an unplanned day can be kind of defined by this question, now what? You will have to make decisions of what to do next all throughout the day. And in contrast, a planned day kind of tells you now this, because you're working from some kind of plan where you already at a different time decided what to do. And the big question, is day planning right for you? And the short answer is most likely. Day planning is one of these things that is so central to a good productivity system. And when you work with a productivity expert or do some kind of productivity webinar or read a productivity book, most likely there's some version of day planning in there. It's kind of really a central part of any good productivity system. So it's very, very likely that this applies to you. And if you're not already doing day planning, you should try to think about it as something that's important, and that you try to figure out how to do well for it so it works for you, which hopefully this webinar will help you with. But I know that there are probably, or maybe, some objections you have in your head if you're not quite sure if day planning is right for you, or if it's a good idea, if you should really invest the time. So let's go over some of these objections. I tried it and it did not work for me. Common objection. The answer is there's so many different ways to do day planning that it's very likely you just haven't tried the right approach that works for you. You haven't found that approach that works for you. So again, you have to maybe just try it in a different way, because it's very likely that there's some way that will work for you. My days are unpredictable, so there's no point in planning them. Again, day plans don't have to be super rigid and specific and just kind of like, have all the minutes in your day that are planned out. There's very flexible day plans that you can create so that they work even for unpredictable days. Now, if you say, you have maybe a job that's just reactive, so that you're just in a store and you just basically your work is only based on what comes up next, like a person that comes in, then you have a reactive workflow where planning doesn't make sense. But we all have, the time after our work, or weekends and other things that we want to do in our life. So there, day planning could still come in very useful. I don't have time to plan. Now this one, you can throw out the window right away, because planning saves so much time. It has such a high return on investment. So every minute that you plan, I think Brian Tracy, one of the most famous productivity coaches, said, every minute you plan, you get back like tenfold. And I would say it's probably even more. And it's not just time you get back, but you save energy, which ultimately also is an important resource for getting work done, for productivity, and just peace of mind and stress that you can reduce. And so definitely do not worry about time. Like if you do it right, and I have a lot of tips on how you can reduce it, it won't even take that much time. I'm terrible at planning. Well, when you're bad at something, that should not be a reason to not do it. You might not like doing things we're not bad at, but actually that's another good reason to do it, so that you can practice it and get better at it. And actually the skills that you kind of practice, or the questions you have to go through to make a day plan, will uncover a lot of really helpful information for yourself. And just practice a bunch of different productivity skills that you can use in other areas. So this should not be a deterrent. And then the other one is, the last one is, I dislike the idea of following a plan. And I think you can see it at the end. It might be cut off at the end, I'm sorry. So the last reason I dislike the idea of following a plan, this one is actually a pretty valid reason, the most valid from all of them. And some people just have a natural kind of aversion to a plan, maybe something that happened in childhood, or your personality, you're free-spirited, you like spontaneity, you just dislike this idea of sort of following a plan, so even if you created the plan. And this is a valid reason, because it's something that could be pretty hard to change about yourself, like it's sort of a preference. And, if there's something that you're constantly sort of not liking in your workflow, you're just making life harder for yourself. So even if there's obviously a lot of benefits to day planning, but it just somehow also creates a lot of negative feelings, it's going to maybe be detrimental then for you to have a day plan. Now, again, don't immediately throw it out and say, okay, this is me, because again, usually when people first think about day plans, they tend to do more rigid ones, kind of like the tasks on the calendar. But there's lots of other ways where you can sort of get this idea of a day plan that might not feel even like a plan to you. So that would be an option. And then again, like if you don't want to have any kind of plan, because you just have such an aversion to it. You just have to kind of weigh what's the bigger evil. Like if you're struggling in your life to be productive and with procrastination and you're feeling stressed, maybe then that's the bigger evil, and you can maybe change your mindset a little bit to realize, okay, this is the lesser of two evils. But yeah, definitely something to keep in mind. So the conclusion is day planning is most likely a good idea for you. Maybe a couple of signs of how you know that you're struggling with stress or productivity. If you're often, just wondering what to do next, and you're spending a lot of time and energy on that, or at the end of the day, you just sort of feel like you got nothing done, you didn't make progress on anything important, or you just don't know where your time goes, you just go somewhere, or you don't really feel in control of your life, or just really unproductive, procrastinating, like you're getting nothing done. Those could all be signs where day planning could really make a big difference. And, best case scenario, if you try to make day planning a focus in the next couple of weeks and really think about this topic and try out the things we're going to go over, best case scenario, life is changed forever. And in any case scenario is that you will have learned a lot about yourself and a lot of information that will help you to find that productivity system that works for you. I actually have talked, before about this idea of productivity system, and that's kind of the idea behind Marvin, the productivity app. It's basically you have to find some kind of workflow, some kind of process of how to get work done that works for you, and that's your productivity system. You have to build this for yourself, and there's a sort of a process to it where you observe, where your issues lie, what things you're struggling with, and then you find solutions for those things. You experiment, you trial and error. There's no way, like nobody can just tell you, read this book, I've made this amazing productivity system, because it's so unique to your brain and to your work. And you have to start somewhere though, right? So you want to have some kind of system, because if you're very new to productivity and you just need help with your life, you need something that you can start with so that you can start observing what is even the problem. And a day plan is actually, this idea of making a day plan and working from that is a great starting point. I'm going to go into that later, but it will uncover more specific issues than if you just, did something else that doesn't involve some kind of day plan. So let's talk about the benefits of day planning. And after this, you should be really convinced that this is a good idea. So basically, what is the difference between having a day plan and not having a day plan? And in some ways, you can look at it as it's defining these two separate phases of planning and doing and kind of separating them, right? And those are different brain activities in some ways. Of course, sometimes the task we do after tour also involves some kind of planning, but planning in terms of figuring out how to map our tasks to our time, which is what time management is all about, and task management, it is actually a really complicated process, and it takes a lot of resources in your brain. And you have to just consider so many different things. You have to consider okay, well, what is urgent? What is important? Then you have feelings like, what do I feel like doing? What can I do right now? I have this limited time. You have to make decisions about priorities. You need a lot of information in your brain at once, kind of juggle it all and make decisions. And making decisions is also a very brain-intensive process. And doing is whatever, you have to do to get your tasks done. So if you're a programmer or a writer, those are different types of activities, and a lot of them require maybe a lot of creativity or just rote work sometimes as well, of course, or physical activity. So it's all kinds of different skills, but usually different brain processes from planning. And planning is the one that's very, very difficult for the brain, meaning it takes a lot of resources. So when you day plan, you're literally separating these two, because you are thinking about what needs to be done when you're planning and you're making your plan. And then when you have a plan, you can just focus on executing it and doing, right? So this is what creates so many of the benefits. Because if you don't have a plan, you're constantly just doing it like this. You have to think about what to do, which is a planning activity. And then you're doing it. And then you have to think again, what do you do next, which is a planning activity. And then you do it. So it's like this. And when you separate them, it's much more efficient, because you only have to load up this information to think about what is a good thing to do next sort of once, because you have it all in your brain and you're thinking about it and you make those decisions, right? Versus just doing it all the time. Also, it's more efficient because usually when you start day planning, you're trying to make that process of planning extremely efficient by itself, by coming up with rules, and we're going to go over that later. So the planning becomes really simple, and you don't have to make so many decisions during planning. It also reduces stress and overwhelm, because when you plan, you do have to kind of, zoom out and get the big picture view and look at all the things you have to do. And that can be very overwhelming. Like, nobody likes to think about, all the things that they have to do, or even just a big chunk of it. But when you day plan, you just kind of like doing that once, something that you can do it in a day. So it's, very reduced set. So that can reduce a lot of stress and overwhelm throughout the day, as well as because you don't have to make a lot of those decisions and, be faced with analysis paralysis all throughout the day. And the other thing is that it can really help with procrastination. And this is kind of interesting because procrastination, I'm probably going to do, by the way, a webinar about just procrastination in 2 weeks. It's one of my favorite topics, really fascinating. And the very basics of procrastination is that when you're faced with a task that somehow elicits negative emotions in you, and it can be for a variety of reasons, your natural instinct is to try and avoid that task, because we're driven to feel, do what feels good and pleasure and conserve energy, and evolutionaries. And that's the brain part that always kicks in when we're procrastinating. It's like, oh, this task is bad, let's not do this. And then, you feel bad and you're trying to do something that just soothes your feelings. So a lot of times we distract ourselves with something kind of pleasurable, like playing a game or, browsing the internet. But what's important when you try to fix procrastination is becoming really aware of where that aversion is coming from. Sometimes just being aware of it can kind of solve it, but also we can usually do something about it and try to make a task less aversive through, mindset changes or changing the nature of the task. But when you just, try to sort of start your day without any planning or intentions, which is, kind of what planning a day is, you might not really know where all the issues lie, because you just maybe procrastinate. But are you procrastinating the decision making because that's so uncomfortable, being faced with all your tasks, or being faced with, this analysis paralysis of not being sure what to do next, or just feeling like, oh my God, I have so much to do, and then you just run away from that whole mountain? Because some people, that's not their issue. So when they start day planning, they can realize, okay, the day planning, that was fine. But then they might still have an issue when they face a specific task. And so there's, this task at 10 o'clock, and they just don't want to do it. But then you notice it in the moment, you sort of catch yourself in the moment. Otherwise, you would never even maybe get to that moment, because you never made a pre-intention to do this task. So you're just kind of avoiding it, like, already before, which makes it much harder to solve the whole problem. And same thing, sometimes people also realize, my problem was just that I just really struggled to figure out what to do. And that's why I was just procrastinating. But when I do have a day plan, I can actually follow through on it and do most of the tasks. So that can be really, really helpful for that reason. This is kind of an interesting point that's not so obvious. It kind of allows you to prioritize better. And what I mean by that is that if you make decisions right before you have to do something, right, there's this risk that you are swayed by kind of immediate emotions. Because in immediate situations, we're often driven to just do what feels good. So, you might want to do this task and you decided to do it now, but then you just tell yourself, no, it's not a good time, right? But when you kind of separated, we're a bit more focused on maybe deeper feelings, more rational feelings, kind of. Also, in some ways, we're thinking more idealistically, obviously, because, we often have this idea that, oh, this person tomorrow is not going to be tired. This person tomorrow is not going to not feel like doing this task. So we think more in terms of what would be good for our project or our life if we got done tomorrow, right? Now, this can have, some cons and pros, but it usually, when you plan before you actually have to do something, you tend to actually plan things that are more important for you to do, and that are less just things that you kind of just maybe want to do. Because that's what happens when people just work from a big list of all the things. They usually start doing the short ones and the easy ones, because those just give quick satisfaction, but it's not maybe what, if you thought about it yesterday, what would really be good for me to get done tomorrow, what you would have picked. So separating this, you usually make better choices. And it also gives you peace of mind, especially if you do it, the night before, sort of to wrap up. Maybe there's some things you didn't finish, but then at least you have it planned for a time that you'll probably get it done. And it just sort of feels like a nice way to close up the day. And the other thing, which I already sort of talked about, is that it just builds so many skills and helps to raise your awareness about yourself and your feelings and what is working in your workflow and in your life and what's not. Because the process that you go through to plan your day, all these techniques, it will raise a lot of questions, a lot of things you have to think about that will just help you kind of discover all kinds of useful things and practice all kinds of useful skills. So now we're going to get into how to stick to a day plan. And this is really interesting because when you Google how to plan your day, often a lot of people search for it together and stick to it, because some people do not have trouble making a plan, right? But they have trouble sticking to it. And I actually want to cover this first because in my book, a good plan is automatically one that you can stick to. And so just to sort of explain what I mean, obviously there's bad plans, right? Like a bad plan is maybe a plan that's just extremely unrealistic. Like some people make these plans where they forget that they're human, they have to go to the bathroom and eat and sleep, and it's just like, you can't work 8 hours a day. That's an unrealistic plan. But there's also plans that technically are possible, but they're not maybe realistic for us in the current situation that we're in for a variety of reasons. Sometimes we have phases in our lives where we just really struggle with productivity. There's no shame in that. Like, almost everybody I've ever talked to would identify themselves as a procrastinator, at least at some points in their lives. And so, yeah, you have to always, always, always remember this when you make a day plan. Always make a plan that you can actually stick to. This should already be built. It doesn't come after. You don't just make a plan and then figure out how to stick to it. You have to figure out how you're going to stick to it while you make it. And always ask yourself, is this something I can realistically stick to? And why? Because there is something extremely demoralizing and derailing about making a plan and then not being able to stick to it. You start to feel bad about yourself because you're not going to, blame the plan. You're going to blame yourself. And a lot of people have negative self-talk, and it's just going to start spiraling. And those things have been shown to be, huge factors in procrastination. So it's likely going to just make your problem worse. Like if you're already not able to follow a plan because maybe you have some productivity issue, if the plan is reasonable, you're just going to make it even harder for you the next day to do it. And you're going to create this pattern of where you have this idea about yourself that you can't stick to plans, kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And yeah, you're just going to make not doing yourself any favors. On the other hand, if you can follow a plan, it will feel really good. And it's going to sort of do the spiral, but in the opposite direction, where you're going to feel really good, confident, like you're in control of your life, and you're going to kind of build upon that. And you can spiral into a positive productivity spiral. And I've worked with many people where, sometimes the switch from being in a negative spiral to in a positive spiral can happen in a matter of like a few days. It's amazing. And it just sort of like, you wouldn't recognize them of the things that they were able to do in their lives before and after, just because of this concept of spiraling, how quickly we can, get into a positive or a negative spiral. So yeah, always be aware of where you are at right now in your life, what's reasonable, and make a plan that you can stick to. And if you can't stick to a plan, do not feel like the blame lies with you. Forgive yourself. Do not, negative self-talk. It's all just a process of learning, and figure out how you can make the plan different and maybe make it a bit, less taxing, or change something about it so that you can achieve it the next day. You don't have to feel like, but then how am I ever going to, get to this place where I want to be in terms of my productivity? Well, that's how you're going to get there. The other way, I'm sure you might have been already doing this for years. It's clearly not working if you're still in that place. So definitely, trust me on this. I've been there, and that's really a big, big change. Make a plan that even if it feels like, well, great, so I'm going to do like 1 or 2 tasks tomorrow. Yeah, but then the next day you maybe are going to do 5 and then already 10. So don't worry about that. Okay, so that's another really good question. And it's, when do you actually plan your day? And there's kind of 2 times where it's a good idea to plan your day. And which one works better for you is, again, you can try through experimentation. I'm going to highlight some of the differences and maybe the pros and the cons. But ultimately, you have to try it for yourself and see what works. So either you can do it sort of as the last thing in your day, maybe the night before or after you wrap up work, plan the next day, or you can do it first thing in the morning. If you do it the night before, it might have the benefit of giving you some peace of mind. If you tend to think a lot about unfinished things, when it keeps you from sleeping, it might be helpful to do it then to kind of get that out of the way and feel like you got closure for your work. And again, you were even more removed from the doing, so it can have the added benefit that maybe you're even more able to not be swayed by your emotions or your fears or your tendencies, and a bit more making a plan based on what you really need to get done. But this can also be a con, actually. And so the benefit of doing it first thing in the morning is also that you have maybe more immediate information, like if you first need to maybe check your email to be able to know what priorities are, or something like that, might be a good idea then to do it in the morning. And in the morning, it can also just be sort of a nice starting point, a really nice start to the day, to think about these, just your plan, and kind of a nice way to get started, sort of productive, but you don't have to jump into work right away. It might also be a good idea if you're not a morning person. And it can be, but is it sort of also sometimes a disadvantage, can also be an advantage, because maybe you can also be more in touch with your immediate emotions, which can be good if, for example, you do have a lot of freedom of what you want to work on, and you can then feel into what you want to work on. So for example, for me, I'm usually much more efficient and productive when I'm working on like a feature for Marvin I'm actually excited about. And sometimes I don't know, like maybe I had an idea, while I was sleeping, and I wake up and I have this new idea of something I want to work on, and I'm really excited about it. So then I would want to take that into consideration for my day plan. So yeah, those are those sort of two pros and cons. So let's get into day planning. And basically day planning is just the goal of a day plan is to give you the answer to what do I do today. That's the basic. So an intention for what you want to do. Now, the optional part is that when do I do it? And I'm going to talk about why that's optional. So basically, when you're thinking about day plans, you can always think of them as sort of being on the spectrum of flexibility. And you have to try to find sort of the Goldilocks, the flexibility that works for you. Now, what do I mean with flexibility? So not having a day plan in a lot of ways is the ultimate flexibility, right? Because at any one time, you could be doing any of your tasks. That's ultimate flexibility. We're already trying to create a day plan to kind of reduce flexibility, because flexibility, sounds like a positive, but sometimes it's not. And we kind of maybe notice from when you go into a grocery store and you're trying to buy a shampoo, and then there's, hundreds of shampoos. And is that making our lives easier or not? It's kind of the same thing with tasks. And to show you sort of the ends of the spectrum, the high flexibility day plan, because we do want to have a day plan, is a daily to-do list. It doesn't really tell you, when you have to do it, so meaning it's flexible, you can move things around. It just tells you sort of what to do. And the other end of the spectrum is the low flexibility plan, tasks on a calendar. And there's many variations in between. And low flexibility just means that, you have very little flexibility. So if something needs to change or rearrange it, it doesn't really work that well because you already have planned out all your minutes. So that's just the extreme version of tasks on a calendar. So again, there's always a trade-off because, sometimes flexibility is good so that we can work with challenges. So if something spontaneous comes up, or we do maybe like to make some choices throughout our day. But then again, we're faced with this having to make choices in between, which zaps brain energy and kind of disrupts our flow sometimes. And then, I think the low flexibility cons are pretty obvious. Then you're not flexible and your plan just always has a big chance of not working out, which is kind of frustrating, and especially with tasks on a calendar, you have to rearrange them a lot. So yeah, you have to basically figure out where you're at in terms of flexibility. And yeah, you want to just reduce the flexibility by having a day plan, but just the right amount. And you can always play with this factor, right? And here actually I'm going to go into just sort of the quick examples of high flexibility, which is just a daily to-do list. That's a day plan too. If you just have a list of, I want to do these things. And of course, the shorter the list, so the less time it takes you, the more flexible it is, because the more, there's room for other things to come up throughout the day that are spontaneous. Well, if you have a really long list, it's not that flexible either, because you kind of have to work all the time to get it done. And this is actually an even more flexible way of doing just a normal to-do list, because you have essential and bonus And we are going to talk about that later, but yeah, just to show you that. And this is the low flexibility example. If you just literally decide exactly when to do tasks, which has some advantages. Like, it can be extremely efficient to work like this because you have not think about it, you just follow it. But it does require some kind of, high discipline so that you can actually always just do what it says and you don't just procrastinate. And it requires you to be really good at time estimation of how long something takes, and you need to kind of have a line of work where there's not going to be a lot of spontaneous interruptions or spontaneous work that comes up. But it can be extremely efficient to do that. And yeah, some people just really like it and get a lot of satisfaction from having a plan like that. So yeah, this is what I already talked about. If you want to have a low flexibility plan, there are advantages, usually with efficiency. But you need to have no interruptions, no spontaneous work, great time estimation skills, high discipline, affinity for structured plans, and awareness of the pitfalls so that you can actually make a good plan. And yeah, a healthy mindset so that if something does get derailed, that you can deal with it and it's not going to cause extra stress just because you had this plan that didn't work out, because nobody needs extra stress. So the question is often, when you try to find sort of this Goldilocks thing, right? And I always said you have to start somewhere and then just adjust. Where do you start, on the high end or the low flexibility? And personally, I recommend for most people that you start with the daily to-do list and then add in more structure if you need it and if you want to increase your efficiency. That's just what works for most people. But if you feel like you have all these things, feel free to start with tasks on a calendar. So when you kind of tweak your day planning, there's a couple of things we can think about. And flexibility is one thing, right? So, but what does that mean? How do we change the flexibility of our day plan? What are all these variations I always talk about? So one of them is time specificity. And that is, if you plan what to do, which is the basic of the day plan, do you also plan when to do it? That's time specificity. And that's also on sort of a scale, on a spectrum. Because no time specificity is just if you have a to-do list. High time specificity is if you literally say when to do a task. But you can also do sort of a middle thing where you just maybe have blocks, like morning, afternoon, evening. And then you kind of just decide, this I do in the morning, this I do in the afternoon. So that's kind of a medium thing. So that's something you can play around with to see what works for you. Variability is another kind of lever that you can sort of tweak. And that means how many different things are you working on in a day? So let's say you have a bunch of different projects or different areas of your life you're focusing on. You have to ask yourself sort of this question, what works for me? Is it easier if I just focus on one project at a day? Is that what makes me able to do my best work and create the least stress? Or do I get bored with that? Maybe I need 2 things I work on in a day. Or maybe I like just working a little bit on everything. It's very, very individual. There's always pros and cons to it all. And again, it's I could talk about these things for a really long time, but we don't have time. So, but I'm going to do another webinar on sort of how to find your productivity system, which this is part of. So the other thing is granularity. So if you have a to-do list, how detailed are your steps? Do you just write finish blog post, or do you kind of make smaller steps underneath that where you say, edit this, add this image, then tweet it out? It can definitely help with procrastination because we tend to not want to do things that sort of feel big and vague. But that's another thing to think about. And then specificity in general. Do you define exactly which task to tackle? So let's say you do have a project you're working on, like redesigning a landing page. Do you plan exactly, tomorrow I'm going to change the color of the header, I'm going to do this, or you're just going to say, I'm just going to work 2 or 3 hours on this. So that's kind of the specificity. And again, this is another, if you probably noticed that's another way you can add in some choice. So maybe you have just decided that you're going to work on a project, but you haven't decided exactly which task. So you can kind of do that on the spot. So it's not like, extremely rigid. So when we day plan, there's sort of, it fits into a productivity system. And what comes before? Because we want to make day planning easy for ourselves. And this is something I call preparations, right? Because the day planning helps you to get work done. But the preparations help you to day plan. Because day planning should also be, relatively easy, and we want to make life easy for ourselves. So again, preparations, which we're going to talk about now, are the things that you kind of do before, maybe, just a couple times or continuously, so that you have a system that makes it easy for you to day plan. And then the day planning will help you actually get the work done. So the preparations, what are they? And this is sort of how you can think about, your challenge that the productivity system is trying to solve. And you just have your tasks and you have your time and you're trying to map them so that when do you do what. And there are preparations we do to make tasks easier to manage, and then there's preparations we do to make the time sort of easier to manage so that we can map them sort of prepared. Both of them are prepared, and then we can map them better. So when you prepare your tasks, one thing you can do is you can already sort of pre-filter them so that you don't have to pick from this list of hundreds of tasks that you want to do at some point. And the way I do that is by first thinking about what do I want to do this month. And by the way, this might only really be important if you have a lot of sort of free reign in when you do what. But if you have like deadline driven or you're a student, then this is not maybe necessary for you. But again, so I'm an entrepreneur and I have all these things I could be working on for Marvin all the time. So I try to think about first what do I want to do this month, and then I have that list and I split it up into the weeks. So I have a weekly list, and then when I day plan, I pick from that weekly list. So that already makes day planning so much easier for myself. And you can also sort a list by urgency. So if you have, work, like I said before, with a lot of deadlines, like you're a student or you work where you have deadlines, you want to add that data so that that's also something you can consider while you're day planning. Okay, what's actually urgent? And then the same thing with importance, so that you can kind of figure out what's important and consider that and some kind of priority system. And you want to have your tasks sorted so that you kind of know, okay, this belongs to this category, this belongs to this category, this is like, my personal life, this is my work life. And you can also sort of categorize tasks in other ways, so that maybe by activity, so like, this requires high focus, this requires low focus, and this will make it easier later to map it to your time, and it will make more sense later. But you just want to categorize your tasks so you can pick them more easily. And the way you organize your time ahead of time is that you have to think about different things. You have to maybe figure out what time of the day is actually your peak focus time. This is a really important question to know, because it will, if you want to make a day plan where you have some kind of time specificity, where you want to figure out what you want to do in the morning or afternoon, it's really important that you know what makes sense to schedule in the morning, right? And it's always important to sort of consider energy levels, because we don't have constant energy levels throughout our days. There's times where we can focus better, do creative work better. And that's really important to consider. So you have to know the questions, the answers to those questions, if you want to make a good day plan, ultimately. You also need to know when you want to stop working. You want to know how much time you have available each day. Very important question. And even more important, how much can you actually work? Because sometimes time is not the limiting factor. And we're going to actually talk about that a bit more later on how to answer some of these questions. And so when you have those that information about your time and about your tasks, you can now start maybe making some rules that will then help you make the day planning easier, right? Because you don't always just have to come up with the system. So in the end, you're just following these rules, and your day plan kind of almost automatically makes itself. Now, you don't have to make rules. It doesn't work for everybody. It's very specific to your brain and to your work, but it does work for a lot of people because there's so many different types of rules. So one rule, for example, could be that every Monday afternoon you do admin tasks. And this kind of goes into time blocking, where maybe, you map out your whole week and you define which times of the week you do what. Or you just decide, you have the best focus from 8 to 10, and so that's what you're going to write. That's your important work. Or you decide that every week you're going to do one project from your 3 main categories in your work. So for me, it's like marketing, working on a product, and working on resources, and I try to do like one project every week. You maybe have a rule about how many hours you're trying to get to per day when you schedule your tasks, or you have maybe a rule, kind of like a one big thing and then 2 smaller ones. That can just kind of help you, with picking things much more easily, because you're always reducing the set of what you have to think about. So yeah, again, predefined rules for your day plan, it reduces the decision making, it saves energy and time in the long run. So you try to get to some kind of rules, ideally. Now, we have to consider the limits, and that's really, really important, because how much time do you actually have in a day available, and how much time can you actually work? so time is limiting, but energy is also limiting. People often forget that we do not have unlimited mental energy in a day, unfortunately. So, kind of curious, what do you think for you the limiting factor is? Is it that you have just not enough time, but you would have more energy, but you just don't have enough time to do the things that you want? And with time, I mean, sometimes we have sort of pre-commitments like meetings or appointments or other things we have to do. So we feel like we could do more, but time is just a very limiting factor why we maybe can't make progress on some things we want to make progress on. Or is it energy that you do have a lot of time, but you are limited by energy? So often you want to do more, but you can't. So how to figure out what your time limit is, you could take out on the calendar and kind of block out all your appointments, your sleep, hygiene things, eating, transport, health habits. And then you have to also block out mandatory leisure time because, spending time with your loved ones and doing something fun, otherwise why are we even living? And then whatever remains, you could kind of multiply by a factor of maybe 0.2 or 0.5 to account for, a lot of the inefficiencies in our work and natural break times, because your brain is gonna always, when you have been focusing for a while, it's automatically gonna switch into another mode where it's just sort of like cruising. Unavoidable, totally human, totally normal, has a lot of benefits, but we have to account for it when we try to schedule, because we tend to just schedule work times. That's why we use this factor. So then you can maybe get some kind of idea of how many hours you actually have. But energy is kind of almost more important, because for most people that is actually very, very surprising how limiting that is. I'm writing a blog post about this now, and I've read many forum posts and talked to many people about it. And so the way that you can even find out your limit is a great way is to track your task, so how long it takes you to do a task. And obviously when you have a day plan, it helps, and Marvin actually has that integrated. And when you do that for a while, you sort of get to see like this pattern of just there's this amount of hours that kind of is always a bit the same, or you're going to always feel the same after you work a certain amount of hours. And most people are very surprised at how little it actually is, and nothing wrong with that. It's just being human. And for example, programmers often say that 2 hours of programming a day or 3 hours is actually a lot. And that's kind of like where they usually then have a limit. And you can go over your limit, but you're going to feel a lot more exhausted the next day. And so then it's in some ways almost like compensating, because then you're not going to be that productive the next day. So there's this kind of natural boundary of how much we can actually work every day. And it's really important to be aware of, to set our expectations, because so many people, have this idea of maybe 8 hours. That's how many hours you have to work. Yeah, but that comes from a time where people were working in factories. It's very, very different nowadays when we do a lot of mental work. And from, the research I've done, most people say 2 to 3 hours of very, very mentally taxing tasks per day, and 5 to 6 is like really stretching it. That's like a really, really productive day. You'll probably notice this when you time track, when you actually, track the time you are working. And I'm not talking sitting on the computer, because many people say, oh, I work 12 hours a day. Well, you might be sitting on a computer for 12 hours, but I'm sure you're not like actually working. And that's why day plan is great, because you put down things that you really need to do, and then only track when you're working on that specific task, because there's a lot of time that gets lost in between. But yeah, when you time track, you'll find all these things out for yourself. Don't be upset, or it can be very, very helpful actually to just feel better about the level of productivity that we're at. So yeah, if you do this for a while, there will be patterns that emerge, and it's really, really interesting. So now let's get into some tips and strategies. I'm sorry this is taking so long, but yeah, feel free to just watch the recording step by step. So this one strategy and tip is just, you can just plan your morning. And this is kind of interesting because you will have this contrast of what was your morning like and what was your afternoon like. How did you feel about your productivity? You could even log this in a journal. How did you feel while you were working in the morning, or about the stuff you got done? You could time track it and also see, was there a difference of how much I got done in the morning? That's maybe a cool experiment to do. And it allows you to just kind of get time to planning. If like the planning still feels tedious and like not that easy, you don't have that many rules or routine about it, it's probably easier to maybe just plan your days. And the morning is really important anyway. Often it might be enough to just plan the morning, because it kind of sets the tone for the rest of the day. And again, if you're really productive in the morning, you probably already got most of the stuff done that you wanted. So This is another strategy. I already mentioned it a bit before. If you don't, to kind of find a middle ground for flexibility, if you don't want to put specific times, but you also don't just want to have one long list. By the way, ordering the list is another good way to bring in the flexibility down a bit, because then you can just follow through the list, which also reduces decision making. Or in Marvin, actually, we also have another strategy that it's kind of a cheeky way to reduce the decision making, because you can just put all the tasks in a jar and then pick one out at random, so you don't have to make the decision either. But yeah, the ordering works, or you could just try to sort of break it up like this: morning, afternoon, evening. And another way to sort of vary the flexibility is you can just put specific times to some of the tasks that are really, really important, because research shows that if you have a very specific intention of when to do a task, you are more likely to do it. Now, saying you're going to do it today or on a specific day is already pretty specific, so it's already going to increase your chances. But sometimes, committing even by time can make it even more effective. So that's something to try. Then time estimates, one of my favorites probably, and there's some apps that will allow you to do it. I think on paper this might be a bit hard to do, but definitely not impossible. But basically, every time you write down a task, you also kind of think about how long this will take you to do. And then when you plan your day, you get these totals. So in Marvin, these are all images from Marvin, by the way. You get this total at the top where it shows you how much you've planned. And if you know what your limit is, this is a really, really good way to just make sure you do not overschedule your day. Then another strategy and tip is that these first couple of tasks that you start out with, they're kind of really crucial, because they do often kind of, make the spiral go either in the upward or downward direction, kind of set the tone for the rest of the day. So a couple of ways you can just maybe experiment with what tasks are best for you to start out with. Some people like to do just a few short and easy ones to get the momentum going, to sort of feel like, oh, I'm already like checking stuff off. It can kind of, get the dopamine flowing. Or you can just say, I'm just going to do my most important task, because then I have peace of mind, and no matter what happens, I got my most important task done. Another one is to tackle something that's weighing on you. And this is great because something that is weighing on you can really make you unproductive for all the other tasks too, because you're just sort of, this task is in the back of your mind and just causing anxiety or a bad feeling, and then you might not, try to avoid thinking about it. So you just kind of try to avoid work altogether, because you kind of all lump it together. Getting that off your chest, reduces stress right away, a really positive, healthy boost of confidence, and you just feel in a better mood. And when we're in a better mood, it's much easier to be productive. This is another really interesting strategy, and some people call this the unschedule method. I can link to a really great blog post about this below. And basically the idea is that you first plan out all the things that are fun and breaks. So you have to actively plan the things that you might be doing anyway when you're procrastinating. And the sad thing is that when we surf the internet, but we didn't plan for it, we're going to probably feel quite guilty about it in the back of our heads, and we're going to feel shitty about it at the end of the day. And a great solution is to just actually schedule those things. And there's research behind this that does show this really reduces procrastination. If you schedule time to, do those procrastination activities or just things that you like, it really reduces procrastination. And again, this blog post I'm going to link to is going to really go into the details of why, and it's really interesting because, so just one reason is when you put those things down first, right, you're all of a sudden very aware of how limited the time is where you can actually get work done. Because often when we're procrastinating, we should figure, oh, I have plenty of time later in the day, or, oh, it's going to be fine. But when you're actually aware of how little time there is then in between, you really feel like, okay, now I have to get this work done now, because otherwise it's also going to cut into just my fun time, right? And yeah, you just don't have the need to surf, because you know that you can do it later. It really changes a lot of things. Really highly recommend to try this if you struggle with procrastination. And this I already talked about is just having you can still have a day plan, and this is maybe good if you often make very ambitious lists where you're just like, oh, I want to get all this stuff done. Even just putting into a different section that you label bonus can be a big mindset shift, where you don't have to feel bad if you don't get to it. It's just bonus, and you're going to feel extra good if you do get to it because you did a bonus. And it can just, help you to actually create a list that you can finish. while still satisfying maybe this need for feeling like you're going to kind of try to push yourself, because you're just trying to do the essential ones, right? So now we're talking about pitfalls, and then we're actually done. So one of the biggest, most common pitfalls is definitely putting too much on our plate. Sometimes it's really sad to realize how little we can get done in a day. But yeah, we have to consider our time and energy limitations. And as a rule, always err on the side of scheduling too little, because you can always schedule more, you can always do bonus things, but not finishing a day plan can feel really demoralizing and sad and stressing us out. And we like to start with a clean slate the next morning. But yeah, definitely never feel bad when this happens. I still do it, and I've been dealing with this stuff for a really long time, and it just happens. It's life, but definitely always something to be aware of. Then another interesting one is sometimes what happens is that when we make a plan and then we have to follow it, we all of a sudden start to think of these tasks as shoulds, because we kind of told ourselves that's what you have to do tomorrow. And this is psychologically very interesting, because nobody really likes shoulds. It reminds us sometimes of unpleasant things in childhood, where we just didn't really have maybe that as much control over our lives as we wanted. And maybe some of us have sort of this rebellious spirit where I'm not doing what I'm told. And so it's kind of interesting, and it's something where you can shift your mindset around it, where you always have to remind yourself that everything in your life is a choice. Especially these day plans you make for yourself. You are just doing them to help yourself, to make it easier for yourself. It's in no way or shape or form an obligation to do it. Do not beat yourself up if you don't. You are free to do whatever you want. This is just, this is your life. And even if things have consequences, you can still always choose to have a negative consequence. Even taxes, you don't have to pay them. You can just pay, deal with the consequences. It's always a choice. Everything's a choice. Always remind yourself of that. And then another common problem is trying to squeeze everything into one day. And this kind of goes into the topic of week planning. So what I mean is, if we have hobbies, maybe we're learning a language, we have this business we're building, we have something else, some other obligation. Sometimes we try to just find a day plan where we do everything in one day. But this is sort of a topic of life balance. Like, how do we balance the different things we do in our lives? And life balance things are always better considered as a week. And there's actually a book about it. I think it's called 168 Hours. And this is how many hours you have in a week. And there it's better to allocate these hours in the week to those different things you want to do, and not try to do everything in one day, right? Another pitfall is planning the perfect day. And this kind of goes into that when we are planning a day, we're often coming from a very idealistic place of what do I want to be able to get done, not what is realistic for me to get done. And this is very, very common. So definitely be realistic about where you're at in your life, how productive you are, what currently, sometimes, again, we have problems with procrastination. We're unhappy with other things. We're maybe unsure if what we're doing is the right thing. All these things, and they're not constant. Like, it doesn't mean that you are just a procrastinator or, you don't have no discipline. But just be realistic and try to help yourself and make a day plan that's achievable for you and that feels good for you. And, forget about what you really wish you were like, because you can get there. Just focus on the now, though, where you are at right now. You'll get there. And then the other thing is that we often just completely ignore breaks and leisure time, just not even thinking about them or that they need time. That's why I like the unschedule so much, because you do need them. They're so important for productivity long term and just for health and well-being. So I've had experience with stress breakdown, and yeah, it's not a good idea, and so important to really make that a priority, not forget about them when you make day plans. So yeah, plan time off and fun activities, and don't just plan the work. So I hope this was helpful for you, and if you feel like, well, this didn't answer any of my questions, like I still don't know now, what I should plan for my day tomorrow, you have just discovered and described the hard part about day planning, and that is making all those decisions for your life. And obviously this is not something I can just sort of do one webinar about, because it's very, very specific to your life and your work situation, what you should prioritize and what times you work well in. I can do more specific webinars later about maybe if you're a student or if you're an entrepreneur or for specific professions. But yeah, this is the hard part about day planning, like figuring out those details for yourself. Always happy to help. You can always write me if you have questions or if you want me to cover something. But yeah, I hope it was helpful, just sort of to get a big picture of you. And finally, just, yeah, keep it simple. Like, if this is overwhelming, it's like, oh, so many ideas, so many things to try, like, don't worry about it. Like, the simplest idea of a day plan is just to make an intention, what you want to get done in a day, or what you were going to attempt to try and get done. And it doesn't have to be specific. Literally, you can just put it on a piece of paper, write down ideas. It's better than just not thinking about it and just kind of being, here I am, what do I do now? And then just doing something, whatever you want to do, or often, it's maybe not exactly what you would want to do if you thought about it. So yeah, try things as the need arises. Start simple, and then if you run into a problem, try something to fix that problem. And take your time with all this. Productivity is a long journey, and your situation changes, your brain changes. So many things to try, but take your time. It's a time well spent. And just try to have a little bit of fun with it. Yeah. So sorry that it was so long. I really did not go through this before. So yeah, very sorry. But yeah, if you have any questions and feedback or requests, I have time. Feel free to just ask me anything.
So Norm says, for him, mental energy is the limiting factor. And if you have the energy, the time would still be a limiting factor, but you'd be able to get much more done.
Yeah, so mental energy is an interesting thing, because if so Mark just told me, in case you didn't hear, that Norm said for him it's definitely the mental energy that's the limiting factor. And it's interesting, because then often the next question is, well, can we improve the mental energy? Can we improve our energy levels? And in a lot of ways we can, because most people aren't at their max. And it's kind of twofold, because our brain is obviously part of our body, so it's a kind of a physical thing. Like, if we're healthy physical, and our brain can work at optimal levels, and it has everything it needs, and it's healthy, that can be a big part in increasing how much we can get done based on our energy levels, mental and physical. But also just allowing the brain to kind of do its natural process of recovery, which it does throughout the day. And working in ways that kind of setting up our workflow. But this is very advanced productivity things, where we're really trying to fine tune and just get every little droplet out of it that we can, where we're really trying to optimize exactly how we preserve our mental energy the best, in terms of how many breaks to take, what to do in those breaks, all these things to recharge our mental energy as quickly as possible, so we can have the most energy available. Yeah, very, very interesting topic, and probably maybe worth a separate book or webinar or something. But yeah, I would say for most people it's mental energy is very, very limiting, sadly. Oh, okay, glad you liked it, Dennis. Yeah, so energy, just maybe if this is interesting, I don't know, but in the past few years I've actually really focused on fixing, there was never anything really wrong with my sleep, but I just really made it a priority to really optimize my sleep patterns and sleep health, because a lot about sleep quality. And I've also switched to a pretty low carb diet. And again, this is one of these things where people are very, very different. But for me personally, it's made a huge difference in my energy levels. I am extremely alert and productive in the morning, and I kind of just wake up and feel alert. Whereas I used to sort of feel like I was more productive at night, but now I realize maybe I was just really not productive in the morning. And maybe I also just procrastinated all day because I felt so crappy, and so then at the end I just kind of had so much pressure to get work done, and then I was able to work done. But now I feel like I'm almost not able to work at a certain hour. And I also noticed that I used to have this really low energy dip after lunch, where I was just like a vegetable. I just couldn't really work, and that has completely gone. Like, my energy levels in the afternoon are pretty stable, and I'm able to do the same kind of work I'm able to do in the morning. So yeah, it's definitely interesting how these tweaks can really make a difference in productivity. Oh, okay, good good to know that you think an hour wasn't too long. Felt quite bad about it, especially because I said 30 minutes.
Oops.
Oops. So yeah.
So, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Have a good evening.
Bye.
Bye.